Shalom and welcome everyone to Messianic Delaware. Thank you for joining us today for this teaching. My name is Jerry Mitchell, your host and teacher for the day. Well, I don't know about teacher, but I'm going to attempt to continue to explain some things about Passover to you, and hopefully it will be a blessing to you. Now, if you have been regularly joining these, you'll know that we have been looking at Passover from the time of Exodus through the prophets, and you've seen some things, let's just say, change a little bit. There was a period of time early in the history of the nation of Israel when they didn't celebrate Passover. And of course, King Josiah, once he realized and had the Torah read to him, he says, wait a minute, we've got to be doing this. And they went back to celebrating and doing the things they should have been doing. Then after the Babylonian exile, you'll see that the celebration of Passover changed a little bit. Uh, it became more of something that was guided by the priests than by the individual families themselves. So we were witnessing some things that are going on here with Passover. And if you'll notice in the uh, King James, Passover specifically mentioned 26 times in the New Testament, and I use King James as reference because there is always so much reference material available for King James that it just makes sense to use it right now. I don't stick to one translation because they're translations. I try to go back to the original language as much as possible. Um, and there are other times that other translations are better than King James. Sometimes they're worse, but it's a translation. It's what somebody is going to try and tell you it said. But either way, that's why I like King James, just because there's so much reference material available for it already. If we look in John's Gospel, doesn't matter the translation, the events that surround Passover receive the greatest amount of attention. In other words, there's more written about the events surrounding Passover, and that's all of the Passovers during the life of Yeshua. Uh, there's more written about those than anything else, and Hanukkah comes in a close second. John actually uses the events surrounding Passover and first fruits and unleavened bread to demonstrate the messiahship of Yeshua to the Jews. He takes something very familiar and he actually uses that and says, look how we can plug this in and see what it does, okay? But even in John's Gospel, there are indications of changes that take place to the celebration of Passover. Very early in John, in chapter 6, verse 4, you're going to read, Passover, a feast of the Jews, was nigh. This verse is not found in the earliest manuscripts. It was possibly added later, probably much later, because it adds time to the ministry of Yeshua, which better fits the timeline of Eusebius. Now, I'm going to talk more about that once we get back into the Gospel of John, but, let's keep that in mind that when you're looking at John and you read these things, sometimes we have to be aware of certain agendas that are taking place even in Scripture, okay? I want to talk about this thing called Preparation Day because this is we can call it a New Testament concept. It's often described as a day of preparation for any Sabbath, even a weekly Sabbath. And if we look at Matthew 27:62, we see, I should say we read, the next day that followed the day of preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees came to Pilate. Okay? Now, this is not included in the Gospel of Matthew, and I'm going to get to that in a second, but there are 5 other references to Preparation Day in the other Gospels. We see it in Mark, in Luke, and actually 3 times more in John. As I said, John uses a lot of things and demonstrates a lot of things about Passover and even preparation and the Sabbath as well to describe what's going on. But we see this concept of Preparation Day, and it actually becomes part of the celebration. And you'll see that as we go through this, okay? But we see Matthew 27:62 from the King James says, the next day that followed the day of preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees came to Pilate. But if you look in George Howard's Hebrew Matthew, he translates it this way: on the morrow of the Passover, the chief priests and Pharisees came to Pilate. Now they came to him seeking a guard. But the Hebrew writer who wrote this, and it's often called Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew, he didn't think it was necessary to include this thing called preparation. Okay? It doesn't say anything about it in there. You look at the Hebrew, it's just not there. There's nothing about this preparation day in there, probably because by the time Shem Tov wrote this, or whoever wrote this, and it's probably between the 11th and maybe as late as the 12th century that this particular copy is, where George Howard gets this from. It may not have been necessary for a Hebrew writer to include it because he would have been writing to Hebrew readers. So we see something a little different going on sometimes with that. Okay, now if we go back to Matthew 26:17, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying to him, "Where will you go that we prepare for thee to eat the Passover?" Now the Hebrew Matthew is very similar to this, okay? Very, very similar to this. Oh my. The first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples come to Jesus and say to him, "Where should we go prepare to eat the Passover?" We have a problem. There's a problem with this verse because if you look at Leviticus 23:5 and 6, it says on the 14th day of the first month, that even, as the sun's going down, is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, the problem is, on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Where are we going to eat the Passover?" Now, they're either a day late or a year early. Okay? What's going on? Well, let's keep looking. Okay? In the Hebrew Matthew, it reads, in the first day of the holiday of Matzah, the disciples of Yeshua asked, "Where will we eat the Passover?" There's two very reasonable possibilities. One is the text is manipulated. Maybe, possibly. But let's think about it this way. We see the first day of the feast evolves to begin when the lambs are brought into the home to be inspected. Now, this includes that preparation. It would mean that the preparation becomes part of the feast, and we see this in other places. It means that the things that the steps they were going through, okay, what they were doing, the names they were giving to these feasts, because it begins with the Passover, which is an event, okay, it ushers in the week of unleavened bread. And in the week of unleavened bread, you're going to have first fruits. So you have three holidays, or three appointed times, coming together in the spring that can become a little bit confusing if you don't grasp the concept of the feasts. So what I think makes the most sense here, okay, is this concept of preparation now is included, okay? It is evolved to be included with the feast itself. So, and they're beginning to use Passover unleavened bread interchangeably, if I can say it that way. It may be that Passover is an event that begins the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and they just simply include this time that they bring the lambs into the home to be inspected as part of that. We'll see that as it works through here. Mark 14:12. The first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover, his disciples said to him, "Where will we go and prepare that you may eat the Passover?" Well, when did they kill the Passover? It was on the afternoon, okay, of the day before unleavened bread begins. Now, if you kill it on the afternoon, okay, then on the 15th day, right after the sun sets, it begins the 15th day. That's when unleavened bread starts. You eat the Passover at the end of the 14th day, just as the sun is going down before it sets. Then that ushers in that evening at sundown. That ushers in unleavened bread. What's the most reasonable explanation? The oldest manuscripts all agree. It makes more sense to consider the manuscripts were manipulated based on the phrase. Okay? Mark doesn't read this way all the way through Mark. Mark is typical of short, concise verses. This verse, the way it reads in Mark, is almost convoluted. But there's two other places in Mark where it's mentioned that is a continuation of the same event. Mark gets a little confusing there because we're trying to, and there are some things added here. There's no secret to that. You go back to the oldest manuscripts, you see that it doesn't always match, and when you translate it into English, we have to add words that we think are necessary to make it make sense. Sometimes when we do that, it makes it more confusing. Okay? Let's look at Luke. Let's see what Luke has to say. And Luke, this is a good one. The first time it's mentioned in Luke, it says, "Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of Passover." And that's in Luke 2. Luke 2 is typically concise or considered to be a part of the Christmas story, the birth. But you continue reading in Luke 2, we go down all the way to verse 41, and we see now that his parents are going to Passover every year. Now, obviously, this was after they returned from Egypt. We know this. You got to go back to Matthew. Okay, read Matthew chapter 2, 13 through 15. It says, "When they were departed," that is the wise men, the Magi, "the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in the dream, saying, 'Arise and take the young child and his mother and flee to Egypt. And you're going to stay there. You're going to stay there until I tell you to come out. Because Herod's going to seek the young child to destroy him, to kill him. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt. And there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord of the prophets, saying, Out of Egypt I've called my son.'" Now, Herod, according to Josephus, died about 1 BC. Okay, so that would have been about the time when Yeshua was about 3 years old. Now, here's the thing. There's argument over when Herod actually died. Some people put Herod's death at 4 BC, which would have been the same year, okay, that Yeshua would have been born. However, we know that it took the wise men, that brought the gifts. They didn't show up at the manger. They had to come later. They had to see the star. They had to get permission to travel from their king. They had to get their stuff together, their caravan together. They came. It would have been almost 2 years later, after Yeshua was born, before they got to King Herod, which means Herod could not have died in 4 BC. All right? So we see all these things that have to come together. We've got to take all of these clues, put them into like a forensic formula, and figure out what's actually happening here, because we're dealing with clues that are over 2,000 years old now, right? So don't get confused when you say, well, Herod died in 4 BC. No, it's impossible for Herod to have died in 4 BC. Can't happen, especially when you look at Josephus. Josephus says it was about 1 BC, and I think he puts it in March. Makes absolute perfect sense at this. It would have been about a year after. Herod would have had plenty of time to have received the wise men. He would have had plenty of time to order the decree. It just would have made all this sense. And it was about the time that Herod was going crazy, right? They know that he had worms. It's not a secret. You read the detailed history, and we can see what's going on with Herod. We understand why Herod would have said, kill all the babies under 2 years old. Everything makes perfect sense. Timing here is everything. All right? When you understand the history, when you understand the culture, you can put all of this stuff together, and it makes absolute perfect sense. The timing works. Everything works. Let's continue, and we're going to get fast forward to Luke 22, because that's the next time we see Passover mentioned in Luke. And it says, now the feast of unleavened bread drew nigh, which is called Passover. Here we see Luke explaining things, and even he confuses the whole concept, because unleavened bread is not called Passover. It's two different things. You have Passover, which is a meal, and you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which lasts for a week. It's that simple. Luke 22:7, then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. That's not how it works. Okay, Luke 22:11, and ye shall say unto the good man of the house, the master says to thee, where is the guest chamber where I shall eat the Passover with my disciples? Okay, now that's absolutely possible. No problem there. Luke 22:13, and when they went, they found as he had said unto them, and they made ready for the Passover. That's possible too. Verse 15, and he said to them, with desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. All right, now this is where things get a little different. This account doesn't match exactly the other gospel accounts. And why is that? Well, it depends a lot on the translation. It's very, very easy to confuse Luke's account and make it read like they were having a Passover meal at the Last Supper, which is absolutely impossible if you know the history and the culture. It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up here. We know for Yeshua to be the lamb, he must be sacrificed with the lambs of the Passover. We know that well, more on this in a few seconds. Okay, we'll get to it. I promise. It's not easy to get through this stuff, because I've got to take what you think you know and make you realize that what you think you know might not be what it reads in Scripture. Okay? Not all of the verses in the known manuscripts agree, and this causes only a minor problem if you don't understand the history and the culture, which is why I keep saying we've got to dig through the language, we've got to dig through the culture, we've got to dig through the history to get to the truth. When we put all that stuff together, we know what's going on, and we get a video. Instead of these little still moments in time, we can put the whole movie together and see everything from beginning to end. The events surrounding the Last Supper are not the events of a Passover during the first century. It would have been impossible. Just didn't happen. Even though there's some things in Scripture that make us possibly allude to it, make us think about it. Okay? The confusion arises partially from a church agenda that tries to force the Last Supper to be a Passover meal. And we know that just isn't the way it is. As I said before, John uses Passover to reveal Yeshua as the Lamb of God, and it's specifically mentioned 9 times. 6:4, Passover is mentioned. However, Yeshua didn't go up to Jerusalem for that particular Passover. He for some reason, as dedicated as John is to writing about Passover, he should have said something about it, right? But he mentions it in 6:4, and it doesn't show up again until much later. Much later, after he goes to Hanukkah. Now, that's almost a year's time elapsed where there's no mention of anything. So from John 6:4, we can say this is a clue that we watch out for to see what has been added or mistranslated or manipulated in the text, and we can say, you know what, this doesn't fit, this doesn't make sense. We need to really examine this carefully, cautiously, dig through it, and find out why it's here. The only reason that most scholars agree now that it was added was to add that extra year that Eusebius needed, okay? Because none of the other Gospels mention it. No place else is it mentioned. You only see it in this one time, and it makes that 3-year timeline fit for Eusebius, okay? That's the only time we see it. It's the only time it's there. The only time it shows up. It's the only thing that most people are going to agree on that makes sense as to why it's there. It shouldn't be there because it's not in the earliest manuscripts. Plain and simple, it was added later. Okay? Let's continue to Corinthians, where Paul says, "Purge out therefore the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you are unleavened. For even Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us." Of course, Paul is describing Yeshua to the Corinthians here in this verse. So as he's describing this, he is kind of including a lot of things that they may have heard about, but Paul now is trying to teach them and show them what's going on here with this. Now, when we get to Hebrews, we're getting a history lesson. In 11:28 in Hebrews, it says, "Through faith he kept the Passover." This is going to be Moses. "And the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them." This is nothing more than a history lesson, okay? That's all it is in Hebrews, and there's not a whole lot more to be said about it there for that. So, we can see that Passover traditions were added, okay, like when we go back to Kings and some of the other things that we looked at earlier, we see that instead of the individual families slaughtering their own lambs, when they come out of exile, the priests are now slaughtering the lambs at the temple. We see that Preparation Day has been added to be included with the feasts. We see that we have an interchangeable vocabulary now where Passover and unleavened bread are apparently, as far as the gospel writers are concerned, if that is original, and most of the manuscripts all agree on that now we see that these phrases and words are used interchangeably. We see some other things that are going on here, and it's not harmful to the feast. Let's just say it that way. Now, we're going to see, okay, that the modern Seder is not similar to the Passover as described in the Bible, in any part of the Bible. Now, there's some argument over when the Seder actually began. We know that Hillel probably developed it, but some people will look back and say, well, there's evidence of this storytelling in, like the 2nd century BC. And there is, because that's all part of it. And I'll get to that in a second. But depending on what aspect of the meal you're talking about, no, it's fairly modern. In fact, the Jewish Encyclopedia, and I got this directly from them, reads that before the schools of Hillel and Shammai arose in the days of King Herod, a service of thanks, and that whether they're talking about Hillel, the original here, by the way, the service of thanks, of which the 6 psalms of praise, and those are Psalms 13 through 18, 113 through 118, formed the nucleus. They had already clustered around the meal of Passover night. Of this meal of the roasted lamb, the unleavened bread, and the bitter herbs were necessary elements. It continues. The service began with a sanctification of the day, as at other festivals, hence the cup of wine, the Kiddush, the blessed are you, Jehovah, our God, King of the universe, who brings forth, that was from the bread, creator of the fruit of the vine. Another cup followed the after supper grace. Notice it says after supper grace, as on the other festive occasions. But to mark the evening as the most joyous in the year, 2 other cups were added. Very important word here. Added. One after the story, that is the story of the Exodus and the plagues and all of those things, and before the meal, and one at the conclusion of the whole service. The Mishnah says that even the poorest man in Israel should not drink less than 4 cups of wine on this occasion. This number being justified by the 4 words employed in Exodus 6 and 7 for the delivery of Israel from Egypt. And that is, again, from the Jewish Encyclopedia. And the 4 words they're talking about there, of course, are in Hebrew, not in English. Okay? Now, I'm not going to take a whole lot of time and explain those because I don't want this to last for a whole hour. I'm going to try and keep this as short as possible, even though I know I'm going to run long. But still, if you really want to know what these 4 words are, put it in the comments down, in the thing, and let us know, and I will go back and do a teaching on those at another time. All right? Just be aware that they're in Hebrew, not in English, because when you look at it in English, it's very easy to say, oh, well, those 4 words are going to be, I am the Lord. No, you got to go look at the Hebrew, okay? Now, let's continue. According to Gil Yehuda, who answers for Korah, which is like a think tank group, people write in and ask him questions, and this gentleman answered this, and it's one of the most concise answers about this I've ever seen, okay? This guy, you have to be really, really, really good to answer for Korah. And he answered, the Seder Plate as we have it today places the ritual foods in a specific order and has turned into a showpiece, not a functional plate. The arrangement and significance of a special plate is based on the Kabbalistic traditions. And if you know what Kabbalistic traditions means, if you don't, go look it up. The Kabbalistic traditions of 3 sources. The Mahariel from Rabbi Yaakov ben Moshe, and Levi Molin in the 15th century. The Arizal from Rabbi Isaac ben Shalom. And I messed his name all up because I am looking at it crooked. Sorry about that. Rabbi Isaac ben Salomon, Loria Ashkenazi from the 16th century, and the Vilna Garan from Rabbi Elisha ben Shlomo Zalman Kalmar from the 18th century. The style of the Arizal became the most popular setup and gained much popularity as an art piece. So what we see is in this Seder Plate today, it didn't happen until much later, okay? From the 15th, 16th, 17th century, 18th century, mentioned here specifically. And we see that it is not functional, all right? There's a whole lot of stuff that goes along with this. But let's continue. According to Rabbi Professor David Golinkin, the origins of the Seder, and I have actually included the website link here in this, and I believe I've left that active for you. The Seder seems to be based on Greco-Roman table manners. Uh-oh, we have a problem because the Seder appears very Hellenistic. In other words, the Seder, as we know it right now, appears Greek. It doesn't resemble Hebrew origins. Even though Hillel, The second, or the latter, is credited with creating it. All right? Even though Hillel, after the fall of the temple, sometime between the end of the first century and the end of the second century, is credited with actually saying we should be doing this so everybody's doing it the same, so we can all be doing something the same way, even though we're spread out all over the world. It appears Hellenistic, and that includes, leaning to the left, doing this, doing that. All of the rules and regulations that are based on it appear not to have Hebrew origins. This is coming from the rabbis. All right? These are almost fighting words among the rabbis in some circles. Just putting that out there as information. The Seder as we know it today wasn't really developed until the 8th to the 10th century, and it happened in Europe. Okay? That's where it actually began, was in Europe. From the destruction of the temple until today, the celebration of Passover continues to evolve. We see this even among our own, let's just say, Messianic and Hebrew root circles, because practically every group who chooses to celebrate Passover celebrates differently, although most will tell of Moses and how he was sent to bring the children of Abraham out of Egypt. It maintains that core, but it's going to be different. Okay? Not one group is going to celebrate exactly the same as another group. So let's keep that in mind. So the question should be, is it wrong to use a Seder to celebrate Passover? Absolutely not. Simply remember that a Seder is a way to tell the story of Passover. And it comes with a lot of rules. We can't keep the Passover. In fact, in Leviticus 23, it doesn't say anything about keeping the Passover. It doesn't say anything about guarding the Passover. It says we are to proclaim the feasts. And what the word proclaim there means, it means we recall it, we read it, we remember it, we tell the story about it, we celebrate it. Okay? As long as we are doing something, and I hate to say it that way, because my father used to say, do something even if it's wrong. If you are proclaiming the feast, if you're recalling the feast, if you're remembering the feast, if you're reading about them, if you're telling the story, no, it's not wrong to use a Seder to do that if you need that type of discipline in your celebration. If you desire that type of order in your celebration, it's perfectly okay to do that. It's also okay to say, I don't want the modern traditions. I want to do this as basic and as close to the original as I can possibly do it. Now, I know there's going to be a lot of places around the world where they're not going to allow you to take a lamb and slaughter it in your front yard so that you can spread the blood on your doorpost. Okay, that's just not going to happen in a lot of places. And that's okay. That's okay. Because it's not about killing the lamb anymore. It's not about spreading the blood anymore. It's not about coming out of Egypt anymore. We celebrate Passover. We remember the past events. We look forward to the future events when we're in that millennial kingdom, that 1,000-year reign, when we can celebrate with Yeshua. When he will be the one who says, this is exactly how I had it planned out. This is how we're going to do this. Now, when I actually do the Passover meal for Messianic Delaware, it's not going to be a true Seder as we know it today. And I'm going to attempt, I don't know if it's going to work, but I'm going to attempt to record it so I don't have to do it twice. So you'll have that audio recording to hear what I say. But I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about coming out of Egypt and what happens when we come out, what our responsibility is after we come out. Because we need to understand that once you leave Egypt, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be pleasant sometimes. Okay? Which is exactly why we need to proclaim these feasts. We need to remember them. We need to recall them. We need to talk about them. We need to study them. We need to figure out what's going on with them, folks, because these things are important. They are very important. Even though they evolve, we see the Almighty use the evolution of these feasts in the crucifixion of Yeshua to point to something even more important. What he's doing is really fascinating here, because he's saying, you know what, you've got this going on, and this going on, and this going on, and I can use that. But you're familiar with it. I'm going to show you how it works. I'm going to show you why this works. I'm going to show you why I allowed it. Because even as we mess things up, the Almighty is willing to say, I've got you covered. And I can use even your mistakes. I can use even your rebellion to teach you and to show you and to reveal my glory, even in your mistakes. Again, I hope this has been a blessing. I apologize for running a little long, but it was important. There's a lot of information in this. I mean, a lot of information, and I encourage you to study on these things and to go back, look them up, see my sources, and choose for yourself which path you're going to take. You can either stick with the traditions, or you can go back to the original as closely as possible and say, you know what, there's things here that we have got to know, because we've gotten away from the original intent, and we need to get back to the original intent, right? Because when you see how these things progressed, and we see the changes in it, it's just a fascinating lesson for us. I hope this has been a blessing for you. Amen. Have a wonderful, wonderful week.